Last time we talked a little bit about DuPont, and I told you a story about a dynamite plant. And we are going to talk some more about DuPont and how they figured out about keeping crafty managers honest. And it turns out that back in the day, people used to reward managers for maximizing the return on equity. But there's a problem with that, because the return on equity is simply just the return on assets times the equity multiplier. And the equity multiplier is just 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. So if I'm a lazy manager and I want to maximize my bonus, all I have to do is take on a bunch of debt, buy back a bunch of shares, and suddenly the ROE has shot through the roof. However, while I do that, the firm is getting riskier, riskier, riskier. The reason the ROE is going up is because it's a riskier firm. There has to be a higher return on that equity because it's so risky. And so basically these people were not providing any value just by jacking up the equity multiplier. And so DuPont said, well, let's think about this. What really goes into ROE? Well, we know it's ROA times the equity multiplier. What goes into ROA? It's the profit margin times the total asset turnover. And if we write those out in their equation form, that's net income over sales times sales over total assets. What happens to the sales? Yeah, it cancels out. And so basically what we could say is ROE is equal to ROA times the equity multiplier. We know this is ROA, so we substitute that in. And then when we put that into the formula situation, here we go. We got net income over sales, sales over total assets, and total assets over total equity, which is the equity multiplier. By the way, if you're looking for equity multiplier in the problem and I haven't given it to you, what should you look for? Debt to equity, and then what should you do with it? Add 1. Very good. Okay. Now, at this point, students say, oh, it's just another way to find ROE. It is another way to find, that's a dry, dead one. There's no trash can. They stole my eraser. They stole the trash can. Savages. Okay, back to the story. You see a trash can? Oh, is there a question?
No, I was saying the eraser's like right under the monitor on this side.
And it's hiding from me. Thank you. You think someone was using it to hold the monitor up?
Probably.
That's exactly right. It's the MSU maintenance procedure. Yeah. Oh, good night. Thank you for pointing that out. This thing's so droopy. Look at that. Oh my goodness. Okay. Back to the story. ROE. Now, it is another way to calculate that, but it's so much more. We've already talked about that. So, the thing that you need, oh, by the way, once we cancel this out, what happens to the sales? And what happens to total assets? And what are we left with?
Net income over equity.
Yeah, net income over total equity, which is just ROE. Now, we know that it's profit margin times total asset turnover times equity multiplier, but here's what you need to know. These things actually measure different aspects of the company. And so what we're going to do is this is equity multiplier. We know that deals with the capital structure, which is the mix of debt and equity that we use to finance the assets of the firm. Profit margin is a measurement of operating efficiency. Now, how is profit margin a measure of operating efficiency? When we talked about maximizing our profit margin, did we talk about increasing the price? Can't really do that, right? Because in a competitive market, your competitors, you're going to set the price that way. And the other thing is, as you raise the price, even if you're a monopoly provider, as you raise the price, the quantity is going to go down. The amount you sell is going to go down. And so there's some dangers there. So we said there was only one foolproof way, or only one safe way to increase net income. What was it? Just roll. Oh, yes.
Decrease our expenses.
Yeah, decrease decrease our expenses. And what kind of expenses did we say we needed to decrease? The non-value added ones, right? So we talked about if the packaging isn't bringing value, change the packaging. You can also negotiate with your suppliers. There's all sorts of ways to cut that. So that's why we talk about this operating efficiency, because basically improving our net income is all about eliminating waste. All right, it's all about eliminating waste. So that's the first part. And then there's the total asset turnover, and that is our asset use efficiency. How efficiently am I using my assets to produce sales? How efficiently am I using my assets to produce sales? And so here's the interesting thing. If I decide to maximize my net income by, instead of increasing, or if I decide to maximize profit margin by reducing my sales, what does that do to the total asset turnover? Yeah, it goes down. And if I decide that I'm going to increase my sales to, say, by lowering my price, to raise my total asset turnover, what does that do to my profit margin? It goes down. You can't cheat this thing. You can't cheat this thing. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to say, managers, you need to maximize ROE by maximizing this and maximizing this while leaving this thing alone. Right? And so now we can give managers goals, of these things instead of giving them just an ROE goal. It's important to come up with cheat-proof measures. If a person has the opportunity to meet a goal and to do so quite easily just through a trick of paperwork or smoke and mirrors, will they do it? Do you not recall that people are scumbags? People are scumbags. I'm the same way. They tell me what I have to do to keep my good current standing here. And what do you think I do? I do it, right? But I have to have so many publications every 5 years. Over a rolling 5-year period, I have to have so many publications. Now, I have one publication that's in an amazing journal called the Journal of Accounting and Economics. That paper took me 7 years to write and get accepted. I have some other papers that are in decent journals that took me a matter of months to write. According to the rules, they are equally valuable for keeping me in the good graces of Missouri State University. Which do you think I create more of? Yeah, the easy ones. Managers are just the same. If we give managers easy ways out, like letting them inflate the capital structure with a bunch of debt, they'll do it because that's how people are, right? Does that make sense? It's just like water, path of least resistance, and humans are exactly like that. Questions? Okay, so that's all I was going to say about the DuPont analysis. Now let's move on and talk about some problems with financial statement analysis. The first thing I want to mention is conglomerates. So a conglomerate is a firm that has different subsidiaries or divisions, and they are in different industries. Recall that we said that it's really only good to do ratio comparisons between firms in the same industry. Well, if you're in a bunch of different industries, where are you going to find your benchmark? And so students will sometimes say, well, we could find another conglomerate that's in the same business. So I used to work for a conglomerate. It was called Halliburton. And we had engineering and construction, and we had our oil field services, and we also weirdly had an insurance company. We had a competitor that was called Schlumberger. It looks like Schlumberger. Schlumberger, they were in the same industries as us, except they didn't have insurance, But additionally, they had gas pumps. So if you ever do pay at the pump, next time you do pay at the pump, try reading around on the pump. Some of those are made by Schlumberger, my old competitor. They also make water meters and electric meters, and we didn't do that. Now, there's no way that I can directly compare Halliburton and Schlumberger, because even though they are conglomerates with a lot of overlap, they still don't cover exactly the same industries. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Schlumberger sold its meter business and Halliburton sold its insurance business, which they eventually did. Now you say, aha, they're in the same industries, so no problem, we can now compare them. No. For one thing, we were bigger in cementing, oil well cementing, and fracking, oil well stimulation, and they were bigger in something called wireline logging, which is where you put tools down in the ground to find where the oil is in the whole strata there. So my point to you is this: if you don't know the weights of those different things, if the weights are different, you still can't make comparisons. And so for conglomerates, basically all we can do is compare between periods for the same conglomerate, and even that assumes that the composition of the conglomerate doesn't change over time. So it's very restrictive what we can do with conglomerates. The other thing is seasonality, and we've already discussed this. If you are in a seasonal business like fashion merchandising or catering, there's all sorts of things that follow a seasonal path. It wouldn't make sense for us to look at just the previous quarter. We'd need to look at the 1 year ago quarter, so we've got to be careful with that. For example, if you're selling candy, you're going to have a much higher inventory right before your big quarter, and you'll have a much lower inventory going into your dead times. Then we need to talk about different accounting methods. So in the United States, we use the generally accepted accounting principles. If you've taken an American accounting class, that's what you learned. And accountants like to call it GAAP, G-A-A-P. If you are from elsewhere in the world, you may be familiar with the International Financial Reporting Standards, or IFRS. Now, eventually, they tell us that the U.S. will be moving over to IFRS. When I was a kid in the 1970s, they told us we were going to be moving over to the metric system. Did that work? No. Is my hope that we'll be able to get over to IFRS, is that a high probability for me? I doubt it. Americans are just too stubborn. I mean, Mr. Ali can tell us, people here are more stubborn, right? Okay. I'm not going to put you on the spot, even though I just did. Okay, back to the story. Yeah, we're stubborn. We're like, phew, we don't need your damn kilometers. We don't need your International Financial Reporting Standards. Now, why does that matter here? Because things are accounted for differently in GAAP and IFRS. I'll just give you an example here. In generally accepted accounting principles, you must expense all research and development costs in the period in which they are incurred. And so right now, I'm pretty sure, what are we up to? iPhone 14, 15, 16, I don't know. Whatever the next one is, they're spending money right now to develop that. It's not going to bring in any revenue until future periods, but they're having to pay that right now. And that means they have to expense it right now, and so it's going to impact their net income this quarter. Under the International Financial Reporting Standards, once a project reaches technical feasibility, then you can start treating it like you're purchasing an asset with your research and development expense. You can start capitalizing that expense, which actually means that you're putting off reporting that expense into a future period, so it's not going to hurt your net income. Now, here's my beef with that. Remember, I started life as an engineer, and I can't tell you how many projects that we get to the end and we're like, oh yeah, this is going to work. And then it's that last step and everything just falls apart. So as an engineer, I'll tell you that technical feasibility is when we've finished the product and tested it and it actually works. Apparently Europeans are a little smarter about these things and they can figure out in advance. They're like psychic, they know when this is going to be technically feasible. Can you tell I'm suspicious and skeptical of this whole thing? Anyway, it's going to impact the income statement. And there are all sorts of other stuff like there's difference in how you report leases and all sorts of stuff like that. If you're really interested in that sort of thing, Dr. Jones teaches a class on international financial statements, something or other. Are you in it?
Fin 686.
Fin 686, there you go. If you want to know that stuff, take Fin 686. Then we have the difference in currencies between countries, and this impacts things in a couple of ways. First of all, there's the simple thing of that a 1 unit of currency over here isn't worth 1 unit of currency over here. Right now, $1 will buy you 7 Chinese RMB, and so that means that a Chinese net income could be 7 times as high as yours and basically be the same. Now, by the way, Chinese have yet a different accounting system. Some like special Chinese system. Okay, so that's the first problem. The second problem is this. When you've got different currencies, if you've got multinational operations and you are a U.S. firm, you have to convert those currencies back to U.S. dollars before you can report them. Currencies fluctuate versus one another. Right now, the dollar's pretty strong. And so the dollars that these firms are reporting from their overseas operations are actually down. Does that mean that their overseas operations are any less efficient? Absolutely not. And so you got to be careful of that too. And then finally, we'll talk about the different methods of accounting for inventory, LIFO versus FIFO. Can anyone tell me what LIFO stands for? Last in, first out. And what does FIFO stand for? First in, first out. Now, why does that make any difference? It's these three very important words here: in inflationary times. And it just turns out so handy right now that we've got huge inflation, because previously when I would give this talk like 3 years ago, students were like, inflation's not a big deal. No one cares about that crap. Only old people remember inflation. Old people like me, right? Now you can remember it too, and you know it's a real thing, right? Now let's talk about how LIFO and FIFO and inflation work together. In first in, first out accounting, the oldest thing in your inventory, that's the price you're going, or the cost you're going to assign to the next thing that you sell. Now, it doesn't matter which one you grab off the shelf. You could grab the newest one, it doesn't matter, but you're going to use the cost from the oldest one. And that cost is going to be added to your cost of goods sold and subtracted from your inventory. Now, in inflationary times, the oldest one is also the cheapest one. And so it's going to add the least to your cost of goods sold, and it's going to reduce your inventory by the least. Compare that to last in, first out. In inflationary times, the last thing you bought is the most expensive one. And the most expensive one, when I use that cost to figure my cost of goods sold, it's going to push up my cost of goods sold by more. And it's also going to reduce my inventory by more. Now, which would I advise you to do? Any ideas? Say again?
LIFO.
Yeah, LIFO. Why?
Because it reduces least in both cost of goods sales and inventory as well.
Okay, so here's where I would go with this. It increases the cost of goods sold, but it doesn't really, which reduces our taxable income, which reduces our taxes, but it doesn't really impact cash flows other than tax, right? It doesn't matter which one of these things I assign to that cost. If I assign the most expensive one to it, therefore the cost of goods sold is higher, my pre-tax income is lower, and my taxes are lower. Taxes are a real cash flow. So that's why we want to do LIFO. And I will tell you this, when I first went to work at Halliburton, we were doing LIFO accounting. And the new management that came in and hired me, they switched over to LIFO accounting, and it was amazing the difference it made in our taxes. Taxes are a real cost, a real cash flow. Now, as a manager, should you be seeking to legally minimize your taxes? Absolutely, you should be. So it's actually your responsibility to do this. Now, what if we were in deflationary times? Well, Japan's had deflation forever and a day. Which would be better for them? LIFO. Very good. FIFO, sorry. FIFO. It would be the opposite, right? If you're in deflationary times, because the most expensive one on the shelf would be the oldest. Does that make sense? Okay, so now let's think about a ratio that has both cost of goods sold and inventory in it. Can anyone think of one? Very good, inventory turns. So inventory turns is cost of goods sold divided by inventory. And we said last in, first out, in inflationary times makes your cost of goods sold larger and it makes your inventory smaller, right? And so what does that mean? It means that if we use LIFO, our inventory turns are going to be higher, even though we're not really doing anything different than if we had been doing FIFO, as far as the actual turns of the physical inventory. And so you can look at these two things, FIFO and LIFO, and know that they will for sure impact your inventory turns. Ms. Roll, you seem unconvinced. You have a question?
Okay, so you said FIFO is the oldest inventory,
Yes.
which then add least to your cost of goods sold.
Right.
And so.
But we also have to subtract it off of our total inventory, and it's going to reduce the inventory by the least.
Okay,
But if we do LIFO, it's going to be the most expensive piece of inventory. So it's going to reduce inventory by the most, and it's going
For
to
sure.
increase cost of goods sold by the
Okay,
most.
cool.
Does that make sense?
yes,
Cool.
thank you.
Thank you for looking confused. Otherwise, I would not have known. Oh, man. Let me get this off you before you ask your question. There you go. Okay.
Does GAAP require LIFO or FIFO or is it like?
Okay. So LIFO and FIFO is a matter of tax law. And in the United States, you have the option to do one or the other. And of course, GAAP and the IRS kind of work together on this thing, right? Now, it turns out that a few years back, we had a president named Obama. And Obama wanted to get rid of LIFO accounting as an option. So far as I recall, he was not successful. But why do you think Obama wanted to get rid of LIFO? More taxes! What do politicians enjoy doing? Spending your money, right? By the way, it's your money. Spending your money. And so, what do politicians try to do? Figure out ways to get more of your money. Does that make sense? And so that's why he trotted that out. Now, I don't think it worked for him. Do a little Googling and find out. But absolutely, that would have been a big thing if he had succeeded. Good question. Other questions?
I don't know if this is more of a commoner question, but so all this is for accounting and the book value and the representation of your inventory and such as, but for the physical inventory, whether you do FIFO or LIFO, it doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter one bit. Doesn't matter one bit. If I'm doing LIFO, do I have to make sure I'm grabbing the newest one off the shelf? Absolutely. Absolutely not. So let me tell you this. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a warehouse. If you've ever been in a warehouse and you go up, so I used to work in nuclear power, and I would go in the warehouse and just try, screwing things together, make sure they fit and whatnot. I could not tell which of those pipe elbows had been put in that box before the others. Does that make sense? Now, accounting knew that of those ones in that box, we paid $3 for 3 of them. We paid $3.50 for a further 7. Now, when we were doing a project, which one would they use? They would, if we're doing LIFO, they would charge $3.50 when I pulled one of those out of inventory. Did they know which one I pulled? Absolutely not. By the way, when does it become important to actually know how old your inventory is?
It's perishable.
Yeah, when it's perishable. So think about milk, bread, And we even had some things called polymers, like O-rings that seal against things. Those things go bad over time. Did you know that tires go bad? Tires that are any older than 5 years old, you've got to be careful because they start to come undone. And so you'll see people buying these so-called brand new tires on eBay and they're getting an amazing deal. But then they get the tires and you can tell by reading the code that the tires were made in 2014. Is that a good thing? No. And so it's important in those cases to actually know how old your inventory is and to rotate your stock. But for things like pipe elbows, absolutely not. Does that make sense? Cool. Oh, damn. Okay. And that is it for that set of slides. Now we're on to long-term financial planning. Long-term financial planning. So, oh, I gotta swap this. So what in finance and accounting, what's the difference between short-term and long-term?
More than 1 year.
More than 1 year. So here we're doing long-term financial planning. We're actually going to be talking about what's going to happen next year. So we're not even going out 2 years. We're just talking about next year. So, and I'm starting out, this is actually, you're not going to think it is, but it's quite simplified compared to what would actually go on. And I'll kind of tell you some of the differences. First of all, not all projects can be completed in 1 year. So that's the first thing about what I'm going to teach you that's probably too simplified. And the second thing is you should probably be thinking about more than 1 year into the future when you're making these big investments. But for simplification's sake, we're going to talk about 1 year into the future. Now, you would think, as a finance guy, that I would think that finance should lead the way. But that's not true. In fact, financial planning is kind of the back end of the process. The front end of the process is something called strategic planning. So, what is strategic planning? And along the way, I'll tell you about my experiences in strategic planning at a company. The first thing is managers have to make decisions about the future product and service directions for the firm. So, the strategic planning is we're going to figure out what we want to do more of, what we want to do less of, what new things we want to try, and what we totally want to get out of. So right now, strategic planning. I know that things have changed dramatically in the last 3 months at Google and Microsoft in their strategic planning. Why do you think that is, Ms. Cabrera?
Well, one, the economy's bad, they had to do layoffs and they had to cut costs.
Okay, so there's number one. The things have totally changed. We've gone from basically a boom mentality to a bust, so now they're having to dial back. What's the other thing that just came up and just exploded that is going to...
ChatGPT.
Yeah, ChatGPT. ChatGPT has really, in fact, did you see earlier this week, both Microsoft and Google announced their new AI stuff. Mm-hmm. And Microsoft actually did a fairly slick job of it. Google, when they were demonstrating it, the AI gave wrong answers. Did you see what happened to Google's share price immediately after? Mr. Mers, what happened? Yeah, it went down like 7%. That's a boatload of money that just evaporated because they're obviously not ready. So, strategic planning, certainly right now at those companies, they are talking about AI as being a newer area for them to try to push more resources into. Okay, now, who all needs to be involved? The answer is everybody. We need every function of the firm represented there during the strategic plan because each one of them has a role to play. And by the way, if they don't have a role to play, the question is, why are they part of your company? Right? And you say, well, what about HR? Well, hey, if we're going to build a new factory, guess what? We got to go hire a bunch of people. We might not even have the people in that area that could be called upon to hire to our factory. And so, yeah, we need to have everybody involved. So who's going to kick off here? Marketing. Why do you think marketing would kick off the strategic planning process? Who are my marketing people? Why do you think, oh, I've been picking on you. Let's ask you. Why do you think that marketing should kick this off?
Part of the job is to identify areas of growth.
Yeah. So you remember the old pirate ships that you've seen with have the crow's nest and the person with binoculars is looking for land and other ships? That's marketing. They're up there scanning the horizon for opportunities. They're also looking for threats, right? Things that can make our business get into trouble. And so I will tell you about the experience that I had, and this is at a plastics company. We were making additives for plastics. And our additives went into everything from automotive to packaging, all sorts of different stuff. And one of the products that we put stuff into, colors into, were these camping bottles. Not quite like that, but more like those hard plastic clear ones that you see. Back then, those were made out of PVC, polyvinyl chloride. And here's what you need to know about PVC. It's very brittle unless you put something in it called a plasticizer. You can't work with it unless you do that. Well, it turned out that this plasticizer would leach out of the plastic and into the liquid in the bottle. And, you know, as long as it doesn't have any impact on human biology, we wouldn't care. But it turns out that this stuff, which they're called phthalates, these phthalates are an estrogen mimic. First of all, what is a mimic? If I mimic you, what does it mean? Yeah, I'm copying you, right? And so this thing is acting like estrogen in the human body. The second question is this: what is estrogen?
It's a hormone.
It's a hormone. And it's a hormone that is specifically usually thought of as being related to?
Females.
Yeah, females. Okay, so here's the deal. First of all, ladies have more of this than men. We all have varying amounts of both of them, but you know, ladies have more than men. If a man gets too much estrogen, he starts to develop breasts. Some people might be into that, but it turns out most men aren't. And so, as a result, there was this huge outcry, a blow up over this estrogen mimic in these camping bottles. What do you think that did? So our marketing people are telling us about this. They're like, oh, what do you think they told us is going to happen to the market for that product? Yeah, it's going to tank, right? It's going to tank. And so as a result, we knew that business basically was just going to go away. Now, and I shouldn't say totally go away, because it turns out that PVC, there were still uses that were good. First of all, any vinyl siding you see on a house is PVC. And as long as you're not out licking that stuff, you'll be just fine, right? Also, I've got this cleaner at home. It's called Kaboom. I don't even know if they make it anymore. My bottle's like 15 years old. But the bottle is made out of PVC because Kaboom is so nasty. It will eat straight through other kinds of plastic. PVC was the only thing it would work with at the time. So as a result, we knew there was still going to be a PVC business, but it's going to be much, much smaller than it was to begin with. At the same time, this is about 2001, 2002. This was the beginning of the SUV boom. And in the beginning, you guys can't even remember the time before SUVs probably, but the big SUV boom happens in the early 2000s, and we end up with, by the way, SUVs back then were mostly made in which country? The US, right? And so it's big American car companies, and those were our customers. We were making the colors for the dash and for the door trim and for all that. And because SUVs took off, the sales at American automakers took off, therefore the demand for our automotive products went up. So we know we've got a plan for that increase. And so these are the sorts of things that the marketing people are out there looking at and seeing how it's going to impact our future sales, and then we've got to figure out what to do about that. So the next thing is engineering is going to provide us evidence on, or thoughts on technical feasibility And we're also going to bring in our accountants and procurement people to talk about costs. So let's talk about engineering feasibility. And when I first started giving this talk long, long ago, I said, wouldn't it be great if you could have a phone that you could roll up and stick it in your pocket? Right? Wouldn't that be cool? About the size of a pen, and you could just unroll it and make a phone call. When I said that, you could, at that time, developed at the University of Akron, you could get, or I can't say it, I forget which, you could get a rollable display. But each one of them is going to cost like $10,000. And so our procurement people are like, oh yeah, you could get the display for that, but no one's going to buy the phone because it's going to cost too much. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, engineers would tell you, oh yeah, it's technically feasible. And by the way, do engineers really care about costs? Oh, I certainly didn't. We were all about, damn, that's cool. I bet we could do that, right? Yeah, we can make that roll-up phone, and procurement's like this, easy there. We've got to figure out if people will actually pay what it would cost to build this thing. And the answer was no, they wouldn't. Now, here's the fun thing. I've been giving this talk for 15 years now. How close are we to getting a phone that you can actually roll up? CES. Go out and Google CES 2023 phone and see what comes up. Now they've got phones that they like unroll out of the side of the phone to like double the size of the phone. We are getting much, much closer. Okay. Let's see. Then after we've learned about the market, what the market's going to do, and we've discussed technical feasibility, and we've had our procurement people talk about cost. By the way, sometimes it's not just cost. The answer is no, we can't do that because we can't even manage to buy that stuff. I have a friend who runs a company who does stainless steel. And a while back, they were trying to buy stainless steel. They couldn't even get their hands on any. Are they going to be able to increase their sales, even if they wanted to? No. And no amount of money could buy the stainless steel that they needed. And so at that point in time, procurement would have said, hey, good luck. You're not going to be able to get the raw materials. Okay, so now the managers, all working together, have to decide which products they're going to introduce, which markets they're going to try to grow, which markets they're going to try to shrink, and what products they're going to totally dump. And that's going to impact the assets that we need. So let's assume this. What if we've got a factory and it's 100% totally utilized? If I'm going to increase my sales by 20%, can I do it with my current assets? Not current assets, but my present assets. No, there's no way. So I know I'm going to have to invest in some new assets. And so after we figure out what we're going to do with our product lineup, now we've got to figure out what assets we're going to invest in to make that dream come true. And we might also talk about what assets we're going to dump because we no longer are going to be in a particular line of work. Now, remember my story about PVC and the car stuff? It turns out that our assets that we had been using to make the PVC stuff could also be used to make the car stuff. And that wasn't true for all of our products, but it was a happy coincidence there. And so we did not have to necessarily have more assets to make our growth in our car product sales because we also had those assets being freed up because we were getting out of that PVC business. Okay. Questions so far? And I've already told you about that. So now we're going to talk about the financial plan. Financial plan always follows the strategic plan. Remember, the strategic plan basically told us how that we need these new assets. The financial plan tells us how we're going to pay for those new assets. The financial plan tells us how we're going to pay for the new assets. And there are three ways that we can fund new assets. And let's talk about the external ones first. External equity. If I go out and issue new shares of stock, that can bring in money that I can use to invest in these new assets. That's called external equity when I issue new stock. Or I could go outside the firm and borrow money. And in fact, all debt is external financing. Now, you may work at a conglomerate where you can borrow money from the mother company, the holding company, but the mother company is either relying on internal equity, which we'll learn about here shortly, or they themselves have to go out to raise external debt or external equity. And so any sort of money that we borrow, regardless of where it comes from, should be considered external. And then finally, we have internal equity. Let's think through internal equity and where it comes from. You guys have just gotten through reviewing Chapter 2. You've got it in your head. You're ready to go. What happens to net income? Think about the income statement. Net income flows to two places. What are they? Okay, so net income, some of it may flow out in the form of cash. What's the cash that net income flows? What are the two ways that it comes out in?
Goes to the equity.
Okay, so it goes into equity. So basically, we know that if we have net income, it's going to flow into addition to retained earnings. Yeah, dividends. And so basically, we know that net income is equal to this addition to retained earnings plus the dividends. Now, what does that mean? Let's say I make $100 million and I pay out $100 million in dividends. How much was addition to retained earnings? Oh, come on. It's zero, right? If I've got $100 million and I pay out $100 in dividends, the addition to retained earnings is zero, right? I'm not adding anything. By the way, where does addition to retained earnings go on the balance sheet? It goes to, say again?
Is it the last thing on the balance sheet? Sorry.
It's on the balance sheet. It flows to the accumulated retained earnings. Does that sound familiar? No. Okay. So let's just make sure I'm using the right term here. Ah, come on. I'm going to pull up a balance sheet so we can look at this. Okay, here we go. Can you guys see that? Look down in the equity section. First thing we see is preferred stock. That's the only thing here that's not related to common equity. Then we have common stock, and we got a couple of accounts that we have to add together here to get our true value of the stock that's been sold. And then we've got the accumulated retained earnings. Every time we have addition to retained earnings, whether it's positive or negative, it gets added to that. If we are paying out more dividends than we have net income, our addition to retained earnings is negative. What do you think happens to the accumulated retained earnings? Goes down. Does that make sense? And when that happens, the equity goes down. What I'm telling you is this internal equity is equity we have generated inside the firm by making positive net income and not paying out all of it as dividends. Anything that's left over becomes addition to retained earnings and increases that accumulated retained earnings account. If this doesn't sound familiar to you, you need to go back and take another look at Chapter 2. You really do. By the way, you're supposed to have, what, 6 hours of accounting before you even show up in here? You guys need to go back and complain to your accounting professors because you guys should know this stuff. Of course, they would complain that you didn't do your homework, and then it'd be a big argument. Okay. So those are our 3 ways. Those are the only 3 ways. So let's talk about our simple financial planning model. By the way, this is a great test question. Where does the financial plan start? The answer is always sales growth. The answer is always sales growth. Where do we get the sales growth? From the sales forecast. So a correct answer would be sales growth or sales forecast. Now, we're going to make some assumptions. Now, we're going to relax some of these assumptions later on, and we'll see that some of them don't matter one way or the other if we make additional assumptions. But we're going to start with that sales growth from the strategic plan, and then we're going to assume our assets are at full capacity. We're going to assume our assets are at full capacity. And so what does that mean? It means we're going to have new assets to have any increase in sales whatsoever. Now, we're going to make an assumption here that our assets need to grow at the same rate as sales. And I'm going to tell you that's another one of these assumptions that's a simplifying assumption. Here's why. Assume I've got a factory that's 100% utilized. If I forecast a sales growth of 20%, do I go out and build 20% of a factory? No. I go out and build a whole factory, right? This is just simplified, very simplified. Now, the cool thing is if I do go out and build a whole factory and then the sales growth is 20% again next year, am I going to need new assets for that? No, because you're less than fully utilized. Does that make sense? The only reason we're needing new assets now is because we're fully utilized. Okay, we're going to make that simplifying assumption that your assets grow at the same rate of sales, and therefore what we need to do is determine the new level of assets necessary to support that level of sales. By the way, if my assets aren't supporting the sales, I don't need them, right? If they're not supporting what we're trying to do as a business, I don't need them. Okay, now we are going to determine the addition to retained earnings in the new scenario, the addition to retained earnings in the new scenario. And that's going to be based on what happens to the net income and whatever assumptions we make about our dividend policy. Dividend policy is deciding how much of your net income you're going to pay out as dividends. And we'll talk about some different common policies as we go through this. Okay, now that addition to retained earnings, we're going to treat that as our internal equity. Every other bit of financing that we're going to require then must be external. It must be either in the form of debt or in the form of a stock issue, which would be external equity. But either one of those things are external. And in fact, what I can look at is the increase in assets minus the addition to retained earnings will give me the total external financing needed. It doesn't tell me how that breaks down between debt and equity. And then we're going to have to decide whether this external financing needed should be raised as debt or stock or a mixture of both. And that last one will be determined by some assumptions that we make regarding our capital structure. And yes?
Do these assumptions matter if you're a small or large company?
Actually, they should work for basically any size company. But let's assume, so how do I put this? The larger the company, the truer these assumptions will be. Now let's think about this. If sales forecast is forecast to grow by 20%, and you only have one factory, you know you're going to have to build a whole other factory. And so your assets are going to grow by more than 20%. But what if you are a company that already has 5 factories and you add 1 factory? You have increased your assets by 20%. Your sales growth also grew 20%. And so that's what I mean by these assumptions will work better the larger the company is.
So is it a lot riskier for a smaller company to use these assumptions?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, because think about this. Yeah, here I am, and I'm making 100 of whatever every year, and I've got this one factory. If I'm going to go out there and expand, basically double my capacity just for a 20% increase in sales growth, then I'm going to have to be basically hoping and wishing for that other 80% to get filled up. Does that make sense? I'm way too risk averse to be an entrepreneur. I'll tell you that right now. And I know these people, and they tell me their plans, and I say, you're freaking nuts. What do you think ends up with those folks? How do you think they end up? The majority, the answer is not good. I think it's something like 95% of small businesses fail in their first year. It's huge. I don't know if I have the percentage just right, but it's huge. What about the other 5%? So example, you guys know who Sam Walton was. What company did he start? Walmart. Any guesses as to how many times that man went bankrupt before he actually got Walmart to work? He went bankrupt twice. Yeah. Now, let's assume that I could get over my risk aversion enough to try this one time, and I went bankrupt. Do you think that I would ever try again? No. Sam didn't just try 2 times, he tried 3 times. Does that make sense? So, if you're overly concerned about that sort of thing, probably not going to be a good entrepreneur. I know I'm not. Make sense? Good question. Other questions? Okay, so here is our base scenario. And this is probably the simplest income statement and balance sheet you will ever see. In the starting situation, we had $1,000 worth of sales, $800 worth of costs, and that cost includes all of your costs, including taxes and crap like that. And we can calculate our net income there. 1,000 minus 800 gives us 200. That 200 is being evenly divided by dividends and accounts, or addition to retained earnings. Now, there is no rule that says the firm has to pay dividends at all. It is purely coincidence that we have identical dividends and addition to retained earnings here. They could have paid out the whole 200 in dividends, and how much would that have left for addition to retained earnings? 0. They could have paid out no dividends whatsoever, and then the addition to retained earnings would have been 200. Very good. I'm glad you kept after it. You got there. Okay, yeah, so if we don't pay out dividends at all, that whole $200 in net income flows down to the addition to retained earnings. Okay, now let's talk about the balance sheet. Right now, we have $500 in assets, and that is equally financed with debt and equity. Once again, there's no rule that says we have to have those proportions. You could have a company that was all equity, no debt. Can you have a company that is all debt and no equity? No, someone has to own some equity, right? You could have one that's horribly levered, meaning a lot of debt, kind of like banks, 90% total debt ratio, but you can't have 0 equity. But there are all sorts of possibilities there. We do know one thing though. Whatever the debt and the equity are, they have to add together to equal what? Yeah, they have to add together to equal the assets. Okay, and then the final piece of the puzzle is they tell us that the forecast sales growth for next year is 20%. Remember, we said that's the first step in any financial plan, is knowing what that sales growth forecast is. So, we're going to work through a series of examples here, and we're going to use different assumptions so you can see how those assumptions play out. And the first one is we're going to grow while maintaining a constant debt to equity ratio. We're going to grow while maintaining a constant debt to equity ratio. So they don't tell us about our dividend policy, so we're going to forget about dividends in addition to retained earnings for right now. And we're going to increase everything in the income statement by the percentage of sales. Now you got to be careful here. This is another one of the simplifying assumptions, because there are actually 2 kinds of costs. There are fixed costs and there are variable costs. If you had both of them, which one would you increase by 20%? Yeah, just the variable cost, because your fixed costs by definition are fixed. Unless building this new factory got you more fixed costs. Does that make sense? And so that's one of the simplifying assumptions that we've made here. And so we know that the sales are going to be up by 20%. By the way, how do I increase a number by 20%? I multiply by 1.2. Why is that? Because 120% divided by 100% is 1.2. And the new number is going to be 120% of the old number. Does that make sense? Okay. Now that means that my sales are going to be 1,200. My costs are going to be 960. Now basically we've made an assumption here that the profit margin is going to stay stable because both sales and costs are growing by the same amount. This net income, there's two ways we could get it. We could either take the 1,200 minus the 960, which would give us 240, or we could simply multiply it by 1.2 and get 240. So now we know we've got 240 in net income. The next thing, and we don't know how that's going to flow between dividends and addition to retained earnings. The next thing we need to do is figure out what's going to happen with our assets. Remember, our simplifying assumption is that assets grow at the same rate as sales. And so we assume our assets are going to grow by 20%, multiply 500 times 1.2, and now we know we're going to have 600 in assets. What is the change there? Yeah, so it's going from 500 up to 600, right? So we're having to take on another 100 in assets. Okay, now, recall back to something that Mr. I have trouble with your name. DeCall? Yeah. Something that he said. Total debt and total equity have to add together to equal what? The assets. Right now, that's not true. Because the assets are 600 and our debt and equity are only equal to 500. That means we're going to have to raise that combination of debt and equity of at least $100 there. And then let's go ahead and see what that does to us. Yeah, so remember they said that the debt to equity ratio must remain the same. 250 divided by 250 is how much? 1. I need to get, so that means these numbers have to be identical. And so I have to find two numbers that are identical that add together to 600. Any guesses? 300, right? 300. And so when I do that, the other way would be to multiply by 1.2. When I do that, now I know that I've got to have another 50 in equity. I've got to have another 50 in debt. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's see. Where am I going to get that money? Well, we know we've got to have 50 in new equity, and we know we've got 240 in net income. Do I have enough net income to fund all of that equity? Remember, net income flows to two different places: addition to retained earnings and dividends. Net income, 240. Can I pay an amount of dividends that will leave me with 50 addition to retained earnings? Yeah. If I take 50 plus 190 in dividends, then that's going to give me enough equity that I don't have to go out and raise new equity. By the way, I always prefer to use internal equity to external equity. Let me say that again. I always prefer to use internal equity to external equity. External equity, you've got to spend money to go out and raise it. There's a reason investment bankers drive Ferraris. It's because they're not cheap, right? They got to go out and raise that money. Okay, now we said, though, that the debt has to come from outside. We've got 50 in new equity. We also need 50 in new debt. That has to come from the outside. So how much would the external financing needed be in this case? Yeah, it's going to be 50, and it's going to be all in debt. It's going to be 50, and it's going to be all in debt. Questions?
So did you get the addition to retained earnings from the problem? It told you it needed to be 50?
Actually, we knew that equity had to grow from 250 up to 300. And the question was, where are we going to get that extra 50 in equity? And then there's basically two places you can get it. One would be internal equity, and one would be external equity. And so we asked them the question, do I have enough net income to get that all internally? And the answer was yes. And so that's why I chose to have my addition to retained earnings be 50, and that dividends just kind of came out in the wash. In order to get 50 into addition to retained earnings, I have to pay the 190 in dividends. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions? You got it? Cool. Okay. Now, we call that dividends the plug variable. It turns out in mathematics, you got to let at least one thing float, or you're not going to be able to get a solution most of the time. You got to let something float. The thing that we let float here was that dividends. It was what was left over after we got what we needed. And we're going to see that the plug variable is not always dividends. Sometimes it's going to be something else. Should you be concerned with what the plug variable is? No. I will never ask you to tell me what the plug variable is. But as you work through the problem and you see the number that basically we had to figure out what to do with, that's the leftover. That's the plug variable. Don't let that freak you out. Okay, now here's scenario number 2. We're going to grow out while paying no dividend. And by the way, we've dropped our assumption about the constant debt to equity ratio. We've dropped that assumption. Now let's look what happens here. If I say I'm not going to pay any dividends at all, then all of the net income flows to addition to retained earnings. And so that whole 240 is going to flow to addition to retained earnings, which is new equity. I've got my old equity of 250. I've got my new equity of 240. I add those together, and when I do, I come up with 490. Now that I know what my equity is and I know what my assets are, what number can I calculate? Yeah, you can calculate the debt. And so 600, our new assets, minus 490, our new equity, tells us that the new debt has to be 110. The old debt was how much? 250. In order to get from 250 in debt down to 110 in debt, what do I have to do?
Add that income. Add additional income.
Add what?
Add the 240.
Add the 240. Okay, so we've done that. We took the 250, added the 240 to the equity, and now we've got 490 down there. It's not in the picture yet. Let me, boop, there we go. And we said assets are 600, equity is 490. That means the new level of debt is 110. My debt was 250. I got to get it down to 110. How do I do that? Let's make this really
Pay it
easy.
off.
Second?
Pay it off.
Yeah, pay down the debt. Pay down the debt. Does that make sense? How much do we have to pay that debt down? Yeah, 140. Now, if when I bring money in, when I borrow, if that's positive external financing needed, if I'm paying off debt, that is negative external financing needed. Now notice that we've changed the capital structure of the firm here. Now we've got 490 in equity and 110 in debt. The debt to equity ratio has changed. We could not have made this assumption of keeping that the same and keeping the capital structure the same and doing what we're doing here. Wouldn't work. Okay. Questions? By the way, nobody gets this the first time through. You're going to have to go back and watch this video. Okay, now, grow while maintaining a constant dividend payout ratio. It turns out the dividend payout ratio is dividends divided by net income. Right now, the firm is paying half of its net income in dividends. And so what does that mean? It means now we're going to be growing our dividends and our addition to retained earnings by the same percentage. They're both going to be now 120. If I've got 120 addition to retained earnings, what's that going to do to my equity? It's going to go from 250 to how much? 370. 250 plus 120 brings me up to 370. Now I know that my assets have to be how much? What's the new level of assets? 600 minus that 370. How much does debt have to be? 230. Oh, so I'll leave it right there. Debt has to be 230. Debt's currently 250. What does that mean we have to do? How do we get our debt down last time? Yeah, we pay off. We pay off some debt, and we pay off 20. And so paying off 20 in debt is external financing needed of negative 20. Now, sometimes students get confused, and they're like, wait a minute. If you pay that out, it's actually going to lower your assets because cash is an asset, right? You're using this cash to pay down the debt. Here's the problem with that thinking. If I don't pay down that debt, my total assets will now be 620, right? And where do you think that extra 20 is going to show up among your assets? Cash. Does that make sense? That's where it's going to show up. It's going to show up under cash in your assets. By the way, should we be sitting on extra cash? No. We should definitely not be sitting on extra cash because we know it doesn't produce the kind of returns that our investors expect of us. Now, we're going to grow while paying a set dividend and maintaining a constant debt-to-equity ratio. So we've got two constraints at the same time. And so we are told that we have to pay dividends of 200. And we are told, so we know we've got 240 in net income, we're going to pay 200 in dividends. That means the addition to retained earnings must be 240 minus 200, or 40. Where is that going to get added to? It's going to get added to the equity. So we got 250 plus 40 brings us up to 290. Now, if we're going to maintain a constant debt-to-equity ratio, we know that the equity and the debt both have to go from 250 up to 300. But we're only up to 290 with our equity. What are we going to have to do? Say again?
Add 10 in equity.
Yeah, we need to go out and issue 10 in new equity. We're going to issue some stock. And so that's going to be external financing needed because it's raised on the outside. And then we know that that extra 50 that we're going to get in debt is also external financing needed. So our total external financing needed is 10 in equity and 50 in debt. And when I add that together, it gives me 60. Okay, I didn't quite make it through all the way today, but we'll clean up here a little bit at the end, and next time we'll get into review. So please take a look at chapters 2, 3, and 4, and any kind of problems that you have that you can't figure out, bring them to class.